Hey everyone, welcome back. Today, we're going to be diving into a pretty big question, one that's both universal and incredibly personal. Whether or not to have children. You've sent in some really interesting stuff, articles, personal stories, even notes from a family therapist, and
Uh,
we're going to be going deep to try to uncover the insights that are most important to you.
it really is fascinating, isn't it? This isn't just a yes or no kind of thing. It brings
Yeah.
up all sorts of complex emotions,
Mhm.
deeply held values, and sometimes even disagreements, healthy ones, hopefully, within a couple.
Totally. I've got to admit, I've been there. I remember being in a relationship where the whole kids thing felt
Mm.
like walking through a minefield, honestly. We both had all these unspoken expectations and fears, too. And we weren't really good at talking about it.
That's actually something we hear a lot from couples. It makes sense. Because this decision, it touches on so many things in your life, your identity, your relationships, your vision for the future. So where do we even begin to unpack all of that?
Well, one of the most important things is to think about it differently. Instead of it being like a debate you have to win,
Mm-hmm.
think about it as more like a collaborative exploration.
I really like that. So instead of, are we having kids?
Great.
It's more about understanding why each person feels the way they do.
Exactly. Like, let's say you're the one who's ready to start a family. What are the real reasons you feel that way? Deep down, I mean. Is it about continuing your family line, wanting a specific kind of love and connection? Maybe it's about achieving a lifelong dream of being a parent.
And on the other side of things, if you're hesitant or unsure about kids, what are the things that are holding you back? Worries or fears?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's financial things, or anxieties about how the world is, or even maybe a fear of losing your freedom and individuality. Getting to the bottom of those whys, it can really tell you a lot about what's important to each person. And that understanding is really the foundation for working through those disagreements you're bound to have. Remember, this isn't about convincing your partner to change their mind. It's about creating a space where both of you can feel heard and respected.
Okay, I like that.
Yeah.
Creating that space. But how do we actually do that? I mean, it's one thing to say communicate openly,
Yeah.
but sometimes it feels really, really hard.
Yeah, it's not easy. That's why the family therapist in your sources suggests trying some very specific techniques. For instance, instead of jumping into a big emotional conversation, try starting small. Ask each other, what are your hopes for our future together? What kind of life do you see for yourself 5 or 10 years from now?
Oh, that's good. That way you can talk about what you want for the future
Yeah.
without immediately going to that really hard topic of kids.
Exactly. It helps ease you into those deeper conversations. And while you're talking, remember to really listen. It's not just about waiting for your turn to speak. It's about really understanding what your partner is saying. Try to say things like, what I hear you saying is, or help me understand why this is important to you.
I like that. Those phrases are really helpful. They shift things away from winning
Yeah.
and focus you on truly understanding.
Exactly. And one of the most powerful things you can do is validating how your partner feels. Even if you don't agree with them, you can still acknowledge their feelings. Try saying things like, I understand why you feel that way, or it makes sense that you would have those concerns.
Okay, so we've talked about being open with each other and having empathy.
Hmm.
What comes next? I mean, let's face it, even with all this, those initial conversations can be a bit like, I don't know, like walking on eggshells a bit.
Yeah.
So how do we move from those early talks to actually making a decision?
That's when things get really interesting. And that's what we're going to dive into next time. We're going to talk about specific strategies for going from talking to deciding. And we'll even look at some stories of couples you sent us.
I can't wait. Stay tuned, everybody. We'll be right back to keep going on our deep dive into this tough but so important conversation. All right, so we're back and ready to dig a little deeper into how couples actually make this decision. We've talked about understanding each other and having empathy and open communication, but how do you move from those first conversations to actually deciding whether to have kids?
That's the big question, right? And honestly, there's no one right answer. But one thing I found really interesting in what you sent was this idea of deconstructing the decision. Couples get stuck a lot of times
Well,
because they're trying to make this huge decision all at once. It can feel, well, overwhelming.
oh, definitely. It's like trying to, I don't know, eat a whole cake in one bite. Where would you even start?
Exactly. So the family therapist you mentioned suggests breaking it down into smaller, more manageable parts. One way to do this is by looking at different pieces of parenthood, one at a time.
Okay, I like that. So instead of asking, do we want kids?
Yeah.
You might ask, what do we think about different parenting styles?
Uh-huh.
How would we handle discipline? What about things like childcare and work-life balance?
Yeah, exactly. And by doing that, by looking at these smaller parts, you might find out that you have some values or ideas that you weren't even aware of.
Right, like maybe one person imagines a very traditional family,
Hmm.
and the other wants a more equal approach to parenting. Or maybe one person really wants their kids to have a religious upbringing, while the other prefers a more secular approach. Those are big differences.
They are. And by figuring those differences out early on, you can start talking about how to handle them. Or sometimes you might realize that what you each want for your family is just too different.
That's hard to realize, but it's better to know sooner than later, I guess, before you end up feeling resentful or disappointed.
Exactly. Speaking of real life examples, you told me about a couple who, at first, they thought they agreed about having kids. But when they dug a little deeper, they realized they had totally different ideas about what being a parent would actually be like.
Oh yeah, the couple where one person wanted their kids to be very structured and focused on achievement, and the other wanted to let the kids kind of lead the way. They both wanted kids, but what they thought that meant was completely different.
Right. And that's why this deconstructing the decision thing is so important. It's not enough to just say yes or no. You got to really get into the specifics of what that actually means for you, for your day-to-day lives, your values, your relationship.
So let's say a couple has done all that. They've figured out their individual reasons, they've talked about their hopes and fears, and they've even started to talk about practical things like parenting styles and how to balance work and family. What's next? How do they actually make a decision?
Well, one thing the therapist in your notes talks about is something called trial periods, like test driving a car before you buy it.
Okay, how do you test drive parenthood?
You can't, literally, of course.
Yeah.
But maybe you could try some things that give you a taste of what it's like.
Oh, I see. Like maybe offering to babysit for friends or family for a longer time, or volunteering at a school or somewhere where you're around kids a lot.
Exactly. And that can be really helpful. You might find out you love all the, the busyness and the chaos of being around kids. Or you might realize you need more quiet time and structure than you thought.
Yeah, like a reality check.
Exactly. And remember, these trial periods, they can be helpful for couples who are thinking about not having kids too. Maybe those experiences will help you feel even more sure about your decision. Or maybe you'll surprise yourself and find out you like being around kids more than you thought you would.
This whole idea of trial periods
Yeah.
is so smart. It helps you get real-world experience.
Right.
But let's be honest, even with all this communication and empathy and trying things out, sometimes couples just, well, they can't agree. What happens then? What happens when you've done everything right,
Yeah.
but you're still just miles apart in this decision?
That can be really tough. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about next. We'll talk about how to deal with those really big disagreements and what it could mean for your relationship. Stay with us.
We're back, and it's time to talk about, well, the tough stuff. What happens when you've done all the talking and the exploring and you still just can't seem to agree about having kids?
Yeah, this is where it gets really hard
Mm.
because we're talking about a conflict of core values. And sometimes, no matter how hard you try, two people might just have different paths.
It's hard to accept that, especially when you love someone and you've built a life together.
It is. And one of the biggest mistakes couples make is trying to force a compromise when you really just can't. You can't make someone want kids if they really don't. And you can't make yourself be okay with not having them if it's something you really want.
So you're saying it's about recognizing when a compromise is actually a sacrifice,
Mm.
and one that can make you resentful later on.
Exactly. And this is where that family therapist advice is so helpful. They talk about how important it is to understand what's non-negotiable in a relationship. What are the things that are so important to you that you absolutely can't give up on? For some people, it's having children. For others, it's keeping their freedom and independence.
And you have to be honest with yourself and with your partner about those things, even if it hurts.
It's true. Because trying to build a future, when you disagree on something that fundamental, it's like, well, it's like building a house on sand. It just won't last.
Okay, so what if a couple realizes that they just can't reconcile their views on kids? Is that the end?
It depends, but it takes a lot of courage, honesty, and
Yeah.
love. Love for yourself and love for your partner, because sometimes the most loving thing you can do is to let go, to understand that you're going in different directions, and to give each other the space to do that.
It's hard to think about that. Letting go doesn't mean you didn't love each other or that the relationship is a failure. It means recognizing that. Sometimes the best way to love is to let it change into something new.
That's a great way to put it. And it's important to acknowledge the sadness
Mm.
and the sense of loss that can come with that. Even when it's the right decision, it
Mhm.
can still be really painful.
So how do you deal with that grief? How do you move on?
The family therapist says, the most important thing is to find support. Talk to friends and family you trust, or even a therapist. Allow yourself to feel your emotions and remember that healing takes time.
And sometimes healing means finding yourself again,
Hmm.
your passions, your own path, maybe on your own, or maybe with someone new.
Exactly. And here's something to remember. Even if a relationship doesn't last forever, it can still be a chance to grow and learn, and even to love.
That's true. Even relationships that end
Yeah.
can teach us so much about ourselves.
Right.
This has been such a good conversation, even though, well, it's been about some tough things. But these are important conversations to have. We have to figure out how to make this efficient and how to deal with it in a way that's clear and compassionate.
I agree. The biggest thing to remember is there's no one answer about whether to have kids. It's about being true to yourself, honest with your partner, and creating a life that reflects what's most important to you.
And even when you want different things, even when your paths seem to be going in different directions, there's still room for growth and understanding,
Yeah.
and even for love.
I think that's a great way to put it.
So as we finish up this, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's been helpful and interesting, and maybe even giving you something to think about. Until next time, keep exploring, keep growing, and keep those conversations going.